Okay, to create our border, I wanted to show you the finished project first that kind of helped explain how we're going to do this. If you look at our border on the finished project, I want you to notice that we are going to do the top and the bottom borders and then the sides. So if we look at the top border, it's 2 squares by 12 squares across. And the side borders are 2 squares by 11 squares down, okay? And that'll make sense as we are doing our piecing. So we'll move this out of the way. Now we're going to be piecing on this easy piecing grid. This is a really lightweight iron-on foundation, so the most important part of this whole process is making sure that the fusible or that bumpy side is up. You want to check that a couple times to make sure. This is the 2-inch finished grid, and so we are going to be cutting out 2.5-inch squares. One thing I really like about using the 2-inch finished grid is that you can use these pre-cuts. I love the roly-polies because they are cut into 2.5-inch strips, so you just can do that one cut to end up with 2.5-inch squares. And this is also a great way to use up all those fun scraps. Now, I have pieced most of our borders on the foundation already. I just want to show you the last few to help show you the technique of how we're going to do this. Like I said, you're going to cut out your squares. Now, if you look at, it's a pretty light line, which is nice, but if you see that printed square, we are going to take our cut square and just make sure that it is centered inside. Now, one of the greatest things about piecing on top of a foundation is that your cutting does not have to be perfect because the foundation is. So as long as your squares, well, let's do some fun colors. As long as your squares fit inside this printed box, oh, see, now I'm getting them out of order here. Let's make these. We can't have 2 colors next to each other that are the same, right? Isn't that a rule of quilting? Oh, I just did it again. Here we go. Okay, so as long as your cut square fits inside that printed square, then these are going to turn out just great. Now, I am piecing. When I'm ironing the squares down, I call that the piecing. And when I'm piecing on top of a pressing board, like I am here, then I will bring in my little iron and I'm going to press those down. Now, do you see how there's a little bit of wiggle room in between each of these squares? That is because the printed square of the foundation is printed less than 1/16 of an inch bigger than your cut square. And that's going to really help when we start doing our piecing. But I get asked quite a bit, now is this going to come off on my iron? And typically it does not, because your fabric is here and that foundation is underneath. And so I like to just hold for a good 3 to 4 seconds. This is also a good place to use some steam if you have steam. You just want to make sure these squares are really nice and secure. If you see any little corners that are lifting up, you want to make sure those are pressed really nice. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll use my little iron to get all the squares where I want to, and then I'll take the panel over to my big iron that's got some good steam, and I'll really make sure these are nice and secure. Now, if you look at what we have done here, we have pieced, here is our first border that is 2 squares by 12, and the next one 2 squares by 12, and then we have our 2 side borders that are going to 11 squares. I think most people's favorite thing about piecing this way is that you get to see what this looks like before you ever start to sew. So remember we were talking about, we don't want to get 2 colors together. If you have directional fabrics, you can do some really great fun designing because you get to see what every square looks like before you start to sew. Now, before we do start to sew, I want to trim the extra away. So each panel has 9 squares across and 14 down. And so I didn't need to put squares on all this extra part. So I'm going to just trim this off with scissors. Now I'm trimming right along that dotted line that defines the square because I like to save my extra foundation for other little projects. And so I'm cutting right along this line and just getting that excess out of the way. And one more row. Now, one little time-saving tip. So we'll fold this. Let's fold this in half, and maybe in half one more time. Gonna make sure that's nice and smooth. And then I'm just gonna cut through all the layers. Looks pretty easy so far. Okay, we're gonna save this extra for something else down the road. So now, if you look at what we have, this is a panel that actually has all of our border pieces on it. And we're going to sew through the short seams on all the borders at the same time. So when all the squares are down where you want them, you've given it a good pressing so all these squares are nice and secure, then you are going to just fold this on the fold line. Turn it this way. We're just going to fold this on the fold line and sew that 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to take it over to the sewing machine. I've put the 1/4 inch piecing foot on the machine. I do like to shorten my stitch length just a little bit. When I am beginning my seam, I do like to do a little back stitch. So I am folding it on that dotted line or that fold line. And just sewing my seam. Now, one thing that I find kind of fun about this is sometimes the sewing is the tedious part of our projects. But when you're sewing on a foundation, the sewing is actually the fastest part of the whole thing. Now, I don't worry about back stitching on the end. I kind of just sew off the end. Now, we're going to sew through this whole panel. We're going to sew through this whole panel down here to our 10th seam. And actually, I'm going to put a little pin in here so that, whoop, lots of pins. I'm going to put a little pin in here so I don't forget where I wanted to stop. So I'm going to continue sewing, and we're going to sew these short seams through the whole panel going in one direction. Okay, now we have sewn all the short seams throughout our whole panel. So what we're going to do now is we are going to separate our borders. We're going to cut our borders. I'm going to turn it this way. Now remember that our short border had 11 squares on it. So this is our last seam of our row that has 12. So I'm just going to cut this apart. I think it's easier to cut these apart with scissors and just pretty quick. Right in between the squares, just right along that panel. We'll move this out of the way. And so now, before we cut this apart into the two borders, we're going to sew this last seam. So we're going to fold right sides together and sew that 1/4 inch seam. So as long as these squares fit inside that printed box, and as long as it fits safely inside your 1/4 inch seam allowance, these are going to turn out perfect every single time. So we sewed that last row. Okay, so now we have, these are our 2 long borders, and I'm going to cut those apart. I think this will just be a little easier to handle. I'm going to cut these 2 apart all the way through. Almost done. Now, if you notice, I brought over the big iron because I want to have a little bit better steam. So our next step on this is we are going to clip. Let's turn it this way so we can see this. Here are the 2 squares, and we are going to clip right between those 2 squares right up to that stitching line. And just a little snip. It kind of has that little line there so you can see it. Now, one thing that I want to say is not be worried if you happen to snip through that stitching line, because everything is held together by the foundation. So even if you happen to clip through that stitch line, you don't need to re-sew it. It's going to be just fine. We're going to clip in between those squares all the way down, right in between, right up to the stitch line. Now, the reason that we did that snipping is so we could press our seam allowances going in opposite directions. Now, the easiest way that I have found to do this is I press one row. Oh, one thing I wanted to just point out is, do you notice there's really no more extra interfacing around those edges? I like to kind of get all that out of the way. So we're going to press the first row going in one direction. So I've got some steam in here. I like to use a little bit of steam on that, pressing that one row, going in one direction all the way through. And then I'm just going to turn it around. And now I'm going to press the other side going the opposite direction. Using that nice steam to help. Now, do you see how I'm kind of tugging a little bit on this end? I just want to help those seams to just lay a little more flat. And then just to make sure, I flip it over and I press on this side because it's really easy to get little folds right in here. So I want to make sure that these are really nice and flat. So I turn it over and I just give it a real good steam and press from the other side. There we go. Let's see, we'll put this on this side. All right, so now it's my favorite part. We're going to fold right sides together to get ready to sew this other direction. But what I want you to notice is look how those seams are nested perfectly. So there's no pinning, there's no adjusting. These are just right where they need to be. So now we're going to take this over to the sewing machine using our 1/4 inch seam allowance. And we're going to sew this other seam. Now, as I'm stitching along, I want to just double check and make sure that that bottom seam allowance is going in the direction that I want it to as I'm going through. So all the way down to the end. Okay. All right. And this is what you get. See how nice those corners match up perfectly every time? So we're going to bring the iron. I like to just give that just a little press, kind of set that seam. And then we're going to press this open. Look at that nice border. Very quick, give that a nice steam. Now when I'm steaming on the top, after I've sewn these seams, I don't press the iron down really hard because any kind of bulk after piecing, even if your iron looks like it's really clean, it's really easy to get little skid marks from that iron. So I do more of a hovering and I use the steam. And look how nice that border turned out. So now this is our top border that's finished. And so this is our next bottom border that is the 2 by 12. We're going to fold right sides together. First we're going to clip and press those seam allowances and then sew right sides together. And then here is our next section with our 2 side borders. You're going to cut these 2 apart and then you're going to sew and press those just like we did this first border. And then we're going to put our project together.